find that enjoyment. So much so that you would have a chance to share your life with that child. So just say the word, and I'll get you a child. Well, Mother Teresa sounded rather excessive and extravagant, but isn't that how God does things? In kind of an excessive, extravagant way? In fact, Mother Teresa probably got her way of doing things from God. Look at today's gospel. Jesus had just heard about the death of his friend, John the Baptist, killed by King Herod. And Jesus is grieving over his friend. And he's contemplating his own fate, what lay down the road for him. And all the while, a huge crowd was gathered in around him, pressing upon him. And he finds a boat, rows out from the shore, over onto the waters, looking for some remote place that for just a short time he could get away from it all. That he might get a little rest and get some recovery. But that's not what he got. Because as he rowed down the shore looking for that remote place, the people who were left behind ran along the shore and beat him to that point. And so when he came ashore, here was that same great crowd of people. Well, his compassion took hold of him. Even though he didn't get the rest and recovery he'd hoped for. But his compassion took hold of him. And once again, he was faced with all of the reeling problems of the people. Here their needs were so many and they were so profound. And so he set about doing what he'd done before. He began to cure the sick. He began to comfort the anxious and calm the fearful. In fact, his compassion took such a great hold on him that he lost track of time. So much so that his disciples came to him as the day went on and told him that he needed to let the people go to get food for themselves. Kind of made them look more compassionate than Jesus, as if they were really sensitive to their need for food. Except that the words gave them away. Their words. Notice how they said before they talked about food. They said, send them away so they can get food. Send them away. What they really wanted to say is that this is getting to be too much. This great crowd of people and all their problems is too much. Now, of course, the disciples were impressed with Jesus. I mean, here was a fellow who could somehow draw thousands of people to come to him, want to be with him, to be cared for by him. And so the disciples were remarkably impressed by Jesus. But at the same time, this crowd was a crowd. And crowds of people come with crowds of problems. Just too many problems. Too many problems. As a pastor over the years, I know something about folks who come knocking at the door to talk about problems. Just all kinds of people with all kinds of problems. In fact, I'm still being asked 9 years after retirement to work with some of the same people who had problems all those many years ago. It seems those problems don't always go away. And I sometimes get the feeling that I would like to be set free from them and their problems. I have this urge to tell Jesus, Jesus, send them away. We're facing a problem even with our own community, Prince William County, because it's just not unaccompanied minors down along the border, but even 100 over at the program for youth along Bristow Road. One of the answers being circulated is, send them back, away. Yes, it just seems all too much. And surely Jesus should understand, because he tried to find some place to get away from it all himself, although it didn't work. But then hear Jesus' answer. Jesus said, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. Here Jesus is focusing these relief efforts upon his disciples. He's putting it on their backs. Seems rather insensitive and harsh, doesn't it? I mean, such a large crowd, such meager resources, so late in the day. How can Jesus be putting that on the backs of his disciples? They protest. Where in the world do you expect us to get food enough to feed these people? I mean, there must be at least 5,000 people. And we have only 2 small fish and 5 loaves of bread. Can you hear what the disciples are really talking about? They're talking about their sense of insufficiency. Here, they find themselves feeling they're insufficiently equipped to handle the tasks put before them. And likely most of us have similar feelings. Insufficiently equipped. One of the young people I served as a pastor at Good Shepherd over the years, whom I baptized, confirmed, eventually ended up living in Japan, and is married to a Japanese woman and has 2 children. And he's learned many things about the Japanese people. Much of Japanese history, particularly over the past century, can be explained by feelings of insufficiency. Here, Japanese live on a very small island with very few natural resources. Things are scarce and need to be protected. And this attitude accounts for many of the mistakes made by the Japanese people in the last century. And even though Japan has now become a relatively rich nation with an abundance of goods, those folks don't feel all that secure. They still feel poor and insecure. And they continue to work hard just to overcome that sense of insufficiency and insecurity. And again, I suspect most of us have similar feelings. Whether as a nation, as a church, here, we don't have the means. Our means are not sufficient. We look into our baskets, and what do we find? Just 2 small fish and 5 loaves of bread. How can we handle the demands placed before us? And so we protest, along with Jesus' 12 disciples. Jesus, we can't. We just can't do this. Don't you understand? And that's where it seems this story ought to end. But Jesus doesn't let the story end there. What does he do? He says, bring what you have to me. Which he takes. As he takes whatever we bring, every Sunday morning, he takes it, and he blesses it, and he breaks it, and he serves it, and it becomes sufficient. Among the speakers at the ELCA National Youth Gatherings over the years was a fellow named Tony Campolo. Tony was a wonderful and even wild sort of evangelist from Philadelphia. Well, one young fellow who attended tells about hearing Tony. And this young fellow grew up going to a church, but his faith never really got ignited until he heard Tony Campolo. And then this young fellow got so excited that he wanted to become part of a program that Tony was running in in Philadelphia, in the inner city. And so this young fellow arrived early, as the other volunteers did that morning. And he says, well, we prayed and we sang, and Tony preached for about an hour. It was great. And by the time the service ended, we were all raring to go. You all want a witness for Jesus? Tony asked. Yeah, we all shouted, said the young fellow. Okay, gang, get on the bus. Tony loaded up the bus and drove us to the worst part of town, this young fellow said. The windows were out, there were rusting hulks of cars in the streets. We had begun singing about Jesus, but as the bus got deeper and deeper into the city, we all got very quiet. We were scared. The bus pulled up in front of the worst blocks of tenements. Tony shouted, okay, gang, get out here and witness to Jesus. I'll be back at 4 p.m. I gulped, said this young fellow, made my way out the door. With the others, we stood briefly near the bus and prayed. Then we headed out together. I was so scared. I walked to a terrible-looking building, went up a flight of stairs. Everything was dark, and it smelled bad. But I could hear a baby crying. I walked through the darkness toward where the baby was crying. Knocked on the door of the apartment. Who is it? A loud voice came from behind the door. The door cracked open. And here was this woman with a cigarette in hand and a naked baby in the other arm. What do you want? She asked. Well, hello. I'm here to tell about Jesus. With that, she started cursing me out the door, all the way down the hall. I ran down the stairs and onto the sidewalk as fast as I could. I was stunned. I just sat down on the curb and I cried. Some disciple I was, some evangelist. And I asked God for help. And I looked up and saw on the corner a sort of run-down grocery store. I walked down to the store, walked in, looked around. My eyes fell on a box of disposable diapers and also a package of cigarettes. I bought the diapers and I also bought the cigarettes. I went back to the apartment house, back up the dark stairs, back to the apartments, and I knocked on the door again. Who is it? What do you want? Bellowed this woman behind that door. I was shaken all over. As I held out the cigarettes and the diapers, she opened the door. And looking at it, she said, okay, come in. Well, I put one of the diapers on the baby. The woman smoked one of the cigarettes, offered me one. I've never smoked in my life. I smoked one then. I spent the rest of the day in that apartment, playing with the baby, listening, talking. When it was late in the afternoon, she said to me, let me ask you something. What's a boy like you doing in a place like this? I told her everything I knew about Jesus in 10 minutes. Then she said, well, pray for me and my baby. I prayed, then I left, went out, back to the bus, and that evening I prayed again. Thank you, God. I went out to share Jesus, and I found Jesus. I got to be a disciple, an evangelist. I went out to share the good news and received the good news. Here we look into our little baskets. We see nothing there but a couple of fish and 5 small loaves of bread. But then Jesus, by his grace, his extravagant grace, takes what we have, blesses it, and it becomes enough. Amen. The peace of God, which passeth all understanding, keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Amen.